Africa has gotten a flag and anthem independence, but Africa has not received a political and economic independence. And when we speak of the condition of the mother continent, we have to be clear that her condition reflects equally upon the condition of all Africans throughout the diaspora. As Africa goes, so goes the rest of us. One of the contradictions of the African American struggle up until this point has been the fact that our struggle here in America has been divorced from the international African struggle for freedom, liberation, and independence. So one of the reasons why we in the West must pay attention to what happens on the mother continent is because we are affected whether we like it or not. As Africa goes, so goes Africa's children. Now, when we look closely at this issue of leadership, we find that many of Africa's leaders post-independence, more than 60 years now in many cases, were trained in the West, financed by the West, have a Western consciousness. And I would argue that Africa, and I say that in the pluralistic sense, meaning all of us, but in particularly the mother continent, Africa is as much to blame for our situation as are the colonizers, because we have encouraged insincere leadership and we have created a narrative that suggests that the best leaders in Africa are those that are educated in the West. That is a mindset. When I travel throughout the continent, I learn and I see that many of the leaders on the continent send their children to Western-run institutions. The presidents of Africa don't have their children in African schools. They have them in European Christian schools, European Catholic schools, not in African schools. We also have to recognize that many of our leaders in Africa do not emulate the type of behavior that we would like to see from our people on the grassroots level. They buy European goods. They shop in Paris. They shop in London. They shop in America. How can there be a renaissance of the African consciousness when there has not been a renaissance in the consciousness of the African leader? Still further, I think that Africa has swallowed the Western Kool-Aid that suggests being able to vote for somebody means you are free. Well, Africa needs to study the African American and our history, because we have also been taught that having the right to vote means that you are free. But if you look at the 154 years since the so-called African American has gotten his alleged freedom, we are just as oppressed, just as disorganized, just as disenfranchised today as we were when the 13th Amendment was ratified to the United States Constitution. Voting has not changed anything for Black America, and I can promise you, we can have this conversation 500 years from now. Africa will not be better because its citizens can vote. Voting is not the priority. Democracy is not the priority. Development and opportunity is the priority. Let me say it again. Voting is not the priority. Democracy is not the priority. Development and opportunity is the priority. The reason why the West loves democracy is because in a democracy, you can manipulate the elections. In a democracy, whoever controls the media wins most of the time. In a democracy, you give people a false sense of control over their destiny when in fact they have none. So if you don't deal with this issue of leadership, the African leadership crisis, the African American leadership crisis, the African British, the African Caribbean leadership crisis, it's going to be difficult to bring about a revolution or a resurrection of African consciousness and liberation. And let me also say this. The African leader, and there are exceptions, there are always exceptions, but the African leader on the continent, the African leader in America, the African leader in the UK, the Caribbean, Central South America, they are more lazy than they are coward. It is an issue of laziness more than it is an issue of cowardice. Now, cowardice is a big part of this. No one is interested in being assassinated. I understand that. But before you even get to the cowardice, you have to deal with the laziness. The reason why Africa is so enslaved to the West is because its leaders are so lazy and interested in the easiest way out. Very few African leaders are looking for solutions. Most of them are looking for band-aids. No one is trying to solve the problem. They just want to decorate the problem while they are in office long enough to fulfill their terms before they get out of office. Most African leaders spend their time in office preparing their economic future, not the destiny of their nation, but their personal economic futures. People don't get elected to help others. They get elected to help themselves. That is a global reality, irrespective of race. Very few African politicians historically have served the interests of African people, and it's sad. And the reason why it's so sad is because of after all the bloodshed of the 50s and all the bloodshed of the 60s, after all of the loss of life during the African independence struggles, I am afraid and I am certain that Africa will have to undergo a second independence revolution. Not only will this be an independence revolution to finally throw off the yoke of Western domination, but you have to also now fight for independence from your black bourgeoisie. You now have to fight for independence from the conduit. The African leader is the conduit between white supremacy and black oppression on the continent. Why is a country that can grow tea importing tea from the West? Why is a country like Senegal, rich in salt, importing salt? If you have the ability to raise your own chicken, why are you importing chicken from China? The answer is real simple. One of the first things that the European colonizers did when they came into Africa was they disrupted and destroyed traditional African economic systems. You cannot make a people slaves in their own land unless you destroy traditional African economic systems. And so they destroyed the networks of commerce. They destroyed the networks of trade. And they took over the major commodities.